Arc 5 sounds so much worse than Arc V, right? But hey, you get it! It's the 5th Yu-Gi-Oh series, it's the 5th arc. Isn't that such a clever name? Fucking hell. At least it's more clever than the 7th show just straight up being called Sevens. Not optimistic at all about that one. At any rate, I'm Kalice, and I kinda recommend Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5?
俺のターンドロー俺はスケール1の星読みの魔術師とスケール8の時読みの魔術師でペンデュラムスケールをセッティングこれでレベル2から7のモンスターが同時に召喚可能揺れろ魂のペンデュラム天空に描け光のアークペンデュラム召喚現れろ俺のモンスターたちエンタメイトソードフィッシュオットアイズペンデュラムドラゴン
Alrighty then, our protagonist is one tomato-haired Yuya Sakaki. At this point, anything that's a bit of a step back from the extreme teen, yes I know they're younger, but hush, designs of Zeal, despite me actually liking those designs in the long term, is a good thing for the franchise overall. Probably. Maybe Zeal broke me, but Yuya's hair seems tame by comparison. Yugioh up to this point has had a pattern of switching between cool protagonists like Yugi and Yusei, and fun protagonists like Judai and Yuma. Yuya breaks this pattern because he's a wholesome good boy who plays the children's card game for wholesome good boy reasons. He cares about having fun and spreading smiles and friendship, friendship, friendship. This runs the risk of coming off as overly juvenile. I don't mind characters like this, and at times actually quite enjoy them if, and only if, the narrative forces them to deal with the emotional stakes of what is going on. Fun, wholesome characters are all well and good, right up until emotionally impactful events don't emotionally impact them, or worse, get spun into jokes. A lot of this has to do with the tone of whatever series they are a part of course, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a history of broaching, if not fully wading into the depths of some rather dark or heavy subjects. Arc 5 put my concerns to rest within the first episode. Also, he's like competent at dueling, so take that, Season 1 Yuma. In this setting, dueling has changed, and not in a way that affects the real world game. Well, that's true too, but we'll get to that later. In-universe, the Leo Corporation has advanced technology to the point that it actually gives monsters mass and weight. Duelists can interact with them physically during duels now, which has led to the rise of action duels. Duels where participants are actually running around, riding on monsters, ooh, and interacting with their cards in other ways. In order to actually give a reason for duelists to do this, aside from style of course, action cards have been introduced. These are face-down cards that appear in the dueling area, wherever it may be. Terrain can actually affect duels now, which is neat. They can be used by the duelist that grabs them. They're almost always magic cards with a beneficial effect of some kind for the person who grabs it. There were a few duels with traps that affect the person who picked them up, but those kind of just go away eventually. I was initially torn about these. It kind of felt like cheating, like the Destiny draws from Zeal, but eventually I wound up realizing that it's no different in luck from characters just top-decking exactly what they need in a clutch moment anyway, which happens all the fucking time, so whatever. In some ways it's actually better because it has to be earned as opposed to just lucked into. Things can go wrong, maybe someone misjudges distance and fucks up a jump, or someone gets blocked by their opponent, or the card gets taken by the opponent first. Plus it adds an element that's just fun to watch to the duels. Instead of characters just standing still all the time, they're running around trying to get something that could sway the match. It having rules surrounding it is really what makes it okay to me. It's just another aspect of the duel, not something that feels bullshit or cheap. At least not more bullshit or cheap than the entire rest of the game, not that anything in Yu-Gi-Oh! Would ever be bullshit of course. If these duels sound like they could be dangerous to you, you're probably right to have that concern. Acrobatics tend to come with the risk of injury, and a lot of these characters are children. Society is just like, okay with this, I guess. The monsters generally can't hurt people because technology is basically indistinguishable from magic at this point, so shut up. And we'll just assume that the show isn't gonna have a character get grievously injured from a fall, but that doesn't stop certain duelists and certain duels from being complete asshole pieces of shit. Like, sure, evil characters later doing stuff like that makes sense. But there's a duel kind of early on where someone just straight up beats the shit out of his opponent. That really doesn't seem fair. Why this is allowed does eventually make sense, but seriously, shit's fucked up in the moment, and there's like a crowd and everything. Just, how is the Leo Corporation not absolutely drowning in litigation? Is there like a waiver you have to sign? Could a kid or their guardian even legally sign that? Who is letting these children do this? Also, it feels like a very natural transition to later duels where certain characters are trying to be lethal, usually against the children. Gotta love anime. So, Yuya is attending the Yugioh duel school, which was founded by his father, where he's training to be an entertainment duelist. As the name implies, the goal of entertainment duelists is not to be the strongest or best necessarily, but to entertain the audience and maybe even your opponent. This type of dueling developed because action duels, with the ability to move around and interact with your monsters, were a thing. Because this is, of course, a world where pretty much everything revolves around duel monsters, there are pretty frequent tournaments, which means an audience to entertain. I actually like Yuya's goals quite a lot. It differentiates him immediately from every other Yu-Gi-Oh protagonist, and once the real plot kicks in, I found it very interesting to see his philosophy challenged by the very real threat of evil assholes who want to kill him. His character arc is an interesting one, again, very different from what Yu-Gi-Oh usually does, because every other protagonist essentially wants to be strong initially, either to fight for their friends, or to become the best duelist, or whatever. But not Yuya. Of course, the threat in the plot does require him to go stronger, but it's not necessarily something that he wants to do. How that strength he needs to acquire winds up mixing with his duel philosophy creates an interesting character, and how that character influences the actually shockingly dark plot is fun to watch. So, Yuya is challenged by the Miami City, I fucking hate that it's spelled M-A-I-A-M-I, just fucking spell it like actual Miami, action duel champion, Strong Ishijima to an exhibition match. 3 years ago, Yuya's father went missing right before he was supposed to challenge Strong for the championship himself. This led to Yuya's father, and his school, falling into disgrace. A lot of people assumed he just ran away, basically. Seems like a lot of work to avoid a card game, so I'm sure there's nothing else going on there. Nothing at all. Seal also established early on that its plot could be serious/dark, but Yuma tended to crack jokes and not take anything seriously, at least early on. In Arc 5, in the very first episode, Yuya has a flashback to before his dad went missing, where they were talking about his pendulum necklace. That was a gift Yuya got from his father. It's an important character establishing moment for Yuya, and it also shows that even though he's a more lighthearted character, the show knows how to let him have serious moments without undermining them with comedy. It's an important thing if your plot is going to address heavy subjects, which Yu-Gi-Oh does fairly often, and Arc 5 definitely does. This flashback moment emotionally invested me in Yuya, and by extension, Arc 5 far earlier than any other Yu-Gi-Oh series, especially Seal.
振り子と同じさ。大きく振れば大きく戻る。デュエルもそうだ。
デュエルも？
怖がって縮こまっていたら何もできない。勝ちたいなら勇気を持って前に出ろ。その勇気の分だけ喜びも戻ってくる。振り子、ペンデュラムは何かを発見する道具でもある。お前が道に迷った時、このペンデュラムが進むべき方向を指し示してくれるだろう。揺れろ。揺れろペンデュラム。大きく。もっと大きく。
After the angst, Yuya does decide to accept the exhibition match, and it doesn't really go great for him. We get to see the first instance of action duels here. Again, I was pretty skeptical of them at this point. I came around later, just as it seems like Yuya will surely lose the duel. His pendulum necklace begins to glow, and some of the monsters in his deck change into pendulum monsters, which is something entirely new to this setting. Despite no one knowing what the fuck these are, or how the fuck they work, Yuya uses them almost on instinct and wins the duel. The moderators of the match decide to allow this because the automated system allows it, which means the cards must be real and legal, right? This sounds stupid initially, but later plot stuff does explain pretty much every why you could ask surrounding this situation. So I guess it's fine. Got that foreshadowing and actually planned out narrative going on. Signs of good writing. Yay! Pendulum summoning is our new type of summoning for Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5, because every new show has got to change stuff up, for better or worse. For the better this time, I think. Vrain's kinda ruined it, but that's another video for later. The core idea of pendulum summoning is pretty simple, but some of the nitty-gritty detailed stuff can be a bit overwhelming until you learn it. There's a lot more rules surrounding it, basically. Pendulum monsters start out in your normal deck and are drawn like normal cards. They have levels like most monsters and can be normal summoned from the hand like any other typical monster found there, following the same rules. There are 2 new pendulum zones on each side of the field that exist specifically for pendulum monsters. Placing a pendulum monster in a pendulum zone means it is treated as a continuous spell card, which means that cards that affect monsters do not affect it, and cards that affect spells on the field do affect it. Anytime these cards are not in a pendulum zone, they are treated as monsters. Any pendulum monster on the field, even ones in the pendulum zones, go to the extra deck when destroyed instead of the graveyard. Each pendulum monster has a scale number on it, above the area where effects on monster descriptions are usually written. If you have 2 pendulum monsters in the pendulum zones, you can pendulum summon. The range of monsters you can summon in a single pendulum summon depends on the scale numbers of the 2 cards in the pendulum zones. Any monsters, pendulum or otherwise, in the hand who don't have specific other summoning conditions, or pendulum monsters in your extra deck whose levels fall within the range of the 2 scales can be summoned through a pendulum summon. Yes, multiple monsters can be, and very often are, pendulum summoned at the same time with a single pendulum summon. You just have to have space on your field. This is considered a single summon, and you can only pendulum summon once per turn. I'm saying pendulum so often that it's losing all meaning to me. Pendulum, 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 pendulum. It's a lot of information, but if you're watching the show, considering they explain what's happening pretty much every time and rather early on have like an in-depth explanation about how it works, you should pick up on it well enough. Oh, also the pendulum zones were taken out in later, like, real card game formats, and you just have to use normal magic zones instead. Just as an example, if you have scale 2 and scale 7 pendulum monsters in your pendulum zones, you can, with your turns, 1 pendulum summon level 3, 4, 5, and 6 monsters. Oh, and individual pendulum monster effects can vary, but also many pendulum monsters have effects that can only be used while they're in the pendulum zone and being treated as a spell card. It did admittedly take me quite a while to get entirely used to pendulums. Longer than it took me to get used to synchros and XEs at the very least. And I had to refresh myself a bit before writing this part of my script, but I do really think they're fun in the game, especially in regards to how they can synergize with all the other types of summons. Also, they're fun to watch in the anime. Arc 5 actually does something special in regards to synchro and XZ stuff. They're in this show, right from the start, not just as a gimmick, but as an important, regular part of the game/show. I think that including the old types of summoning from previous series should be standard for the franchise. It kind of sucks that other shows don't. It adds more variety to the archetypes that are present in the show, and between that and the speed that pendulum summons provide, I think that in general, the duels in Arc 5 are the most enjoyable to watch. Plus I get to see the XEs that I love so very, very much on the regular again. Like, on average, I'll probably enjoy a random duel from Arc V more so than a random duel from any other series. This is something that's incredibly important considering the vast majority of what is happening in the show is duels. As for some of the characters that we meet early on, Yuzu is the leading lady of this series, though as usual with Yugioh that phrase is a bit misleading. I think she's a fine character, a bit on the generic side, but she has her moments, and she is actually important to the main narrative, which is a step in the right direction, but ultimately I think she gets mistreated. We'll get into the why a bit later. She's Yuya's childhood friend, and one of the very few people still attending the disgraced Yugioh duel school. Her father currently owns the school. Also, I kinda hoped that she would be one of the main duelists, or at least remain amongst the serious/skilled duelists as the plot progressed, based on the fact that she's got the protagonistic YU at the start of her name. She is skilled at the start, but that sadly doesn't remain true in the long term as better and better opponents start showing up, so The other good guy that we meet early on is the man. I know he's a child, but he likes to call himself that, so shh, don't ruin it for him. Noboru Gongenzoka. He's another childhood friend of Yuya's, but he attends a different school. Unlike Yuya and Yuzu, he has no interest in entertaining and just wants to be a strong duelist. He's sort of an honorable, loyal warrior type. He actually has a rather cool archetype, super heavy samurai that involves not using any spells or traps. Nobody tell Joey about that one. After Yuya whips out this new, weird form of summoning in that exhibition match, people are rightly interested in what the fucking deal with that is. Yuya himself is trying to figure out how it works after using them on instinct in that first duel. More people are interested in joining Yugioh now that the hype of these pendulum cards has overridden the disgrace from Yuya's father, quote-unquote, running away. Shenanigans ensue, and the only noteworthy character who winds up joining the school is a boy named Sora. He's very happy-go-lucky, maybe even more so than Yuya. I actually quite like him, especially once the plot starts happening, because reasons. Meanwhile, Reiji Akaba, our Kaiba stand-in and first kinda sorta rival, is trying to research, understand, and replicate pendulum summons, and is using the full financial and scientific might of the Leo Corporation, which includes an entire school full of elite duelists, to do so. Predictably, a lot of the enemy duelists from the first arc are from the Leo duel school. The most notable of these is one Shingo Sawatari, who will go on to be sort of important in the plot later and is an absolute piece of shit scumbag. He goes so far as to resort to full-on kidnapping to get what he wants. Kids, am I right? Pretty early on, a mysterious edgy boy duels against Sawatari as Yuzu happens to watch. After absolutely kicking Sawatari's ass with monsters that can cause real-world damage and actually harm people, even outside of action duels, he removes his mask, an absolutely stupid action because why fucking wear a mask to obscure your identity if you're just gonna take it off in front of people anyway? I'm sorry, but I've seen so much superhero stuff and this always baffles me. At any rate, his face mysteriously looks just like Yuya's, though his hair and eyes are very clearly radically different, so the cases of mistaken identity that are about to take place are sort of goofy, but also we're in crazy anime land with hyper advanced technology, so it's dumb, but fine, I guess. Shortly after this, Yuzu's bracelet glows and the mysterious edgy boy disappears. Sawatari, lackey that he is, reports back to Reiji claiming that it was Yuya who attacked him, which only furthers Reiji's interest in and concern about Yuya. Reiji has some elite LDS students challenge Yuya and friends, which ultimately culminates in Yuya dueling against Reiji. Reiji's deck actually uses Fusion, Synchro, and XZ cards, which I think is pretty fucking cool. Almost cool enough to become my main archetype in real life, but something else won from this show. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Whatever. Using all of the old summoning types, except rituals, fucking rip, is cool, and during the duel, Reiji uses pendulums himself too. This understandably confuses Yuya, considering he fucking magicked them into existence, but Reiji's use of them isn't perfect, or rather his creation of them is imperfect. This is what starts the process of other characters doing pendulum summons. It kind of seems like science trying to replicate magic. It's more complicated than that, kind of, but it's what it fucking seems like. Before the duel can conclude, Reiji is informed of another attack and leaves, because of course this duel wouldn't be allowed to finish, damn it. It's always annoying when it feels like they're specifically trying to avoid showing which character is stronger. At any rate, Reiji now has proof that the Masked Man and Yuya are different people. All of this leads into the remainder of the first story arc, the Miami. Seriously, why the fuck is it spelled like that? I could have just typed it differently in my script, but no, I need the fucking spite in my voice to carry through on these reads. It's important to me. Championship Tournament. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the junior youth section of the tournament because all the main characters are children. Do remember that as stuff gets darker as the show progresses. At the very beginning of the tournament, the qualifying matches are among the worst duels in the franchise, in my opinion. I'm generally fine with the idea of like a gimmick duel, as long as that gimmick doesn't override the actual duel itself, or is like fun to watch. Specifically the cooking show and quiz show duels in Arc 5, I was just so fucking bored watching them. The characters Yuya duels against don't feel like they exist for anything more than a bit of a joke. It could have been cut or shown in like a montage, and nothing of value would have been lost, which is generally a pretty bad sign about quality and pacing and a test of my patience. I'm gonna stop being too detailed about step-by-step plot stuff now, because I don't want to just wind up summarizing the whole show, but basically, this tournament is where all of the previously established plot points come together, and the actual, real, serious plot comes to the forefront. As a bit of a side note, there is a Battle Royale section of this tournament, which is a fucking blast to watch, and in that, they establish rules for how duelists can cut into duels that are already underway and participate in them. Those rules continue to exist going forward into non-tournament settings. I really like that this provides an in-game context for characters showing up dramatically and helping or making things worse or whatever. Putting in an actual rule to support the plot instead of forcing the plot to bend to the rules is smart and helps to more naturally integrate the narrative with the children's card game. Yugioh is somewhere between an action anime and a sports anime. I'd say it skews closer to action than sports, if only because the card game very often has characters literally trying to kill each other. Not exactly the same territory as Haikyuu or Free, though I would watch the shit out of a Bloodsport anime. Regardless, both action and sport anime tend to do tournament arcs fairly often. For sports stuff, that's kind of the natural direction for the narrative to head in, but for action stuff, it can be a sign of poor or unplanned writing. See, tournament arcs can be a sort of artificial, lazy way to construct conflict. It's a surefire, easy way to give pretty much every character in the cast a motivation to fight, or in this case, play the card game, against characters that they might not otherwise have a conflict with. With the way that the Japanese manga industry is set up, mangaka are often pressured to create a large amount of content in a relatively short period of time, and a lot of anime is based off of shonen manga, so, Tournament arcs are an easy go-to to fill for time, while mangaka come up with ideas for the later narrative. That is not to say that all tournament arcs in Japanese media are inherently bad or formulaic, or that this is the only reason one might exist. Hunter x Hunter and Yu Yu Hakusho's tournament arcs are both excellent, well thought out, and varied. Here, I think a tournament arc works for a couple of reasons. While I just said Yu-Gi-Oh is closer to an action anime than a sports anime, the reason it's somewhere in between is because, especially in the later series, the world is set up in such a way that it in large part revolves around dueling. Duel monsters is like the big thing, which makes it feel more natural that a tournament would be happening and that our characters would be interested in participating in this tournament. Having one so relatively early into the plot actually provided some benefits that I hadn't considered. It characterizes and fleshes out characters who will later go on to be more important, and as clunky as some tournament arcs feel, it feels natural to do that here because, again, there being a tournament makes complete sense for the setting. It's very much not used as a means of delaying the real plot, but acts as an effective vehicle for delivering that narrative. It feels not only natural, but good, as the more important hidden aspects of the narrative make their way to the forefront or are teased for later over the course of this tournament. This is going to sound like hollow praise unless you watch a lot of shonen anime, but it actually feels like the narrative for Arc 5 was planned out. A lot of shonen stuff, looking at you, Naruto and Bleach, have really obvious holes in the long-term narrative where things just weren't thought about ahead of time. The consequence is that individual arcs often feel really good, but when they try to tie all of those arcs together, plot holes start to show through. In Arc 5, everything makes sense when you look back at it from the end of the narrative. If you told me that the ending and overall plot structure was planned out before the very first episode came out, I would have believed you. This goes a long way towards making this tournament arc feel good. Its execution has a bunch of seemingly completely separate narrative pieces being tied together by the greater plot and then pushed toward the later conflict. So while I do ultimately think that Arc 5 is worth watching, I think it has a lot of both micro and macro plot issues that drag it down in overall quality and hold it back from being truly excellent. Unfortunately, for my usual obsession with avoiding too serious spoilers, the actual nature of the setting and narrative of Arc 5 isn't revealed until about 40-ish episodes in, and I need to spoil aspects of what is hidden in order to talk about it. I'm not going to spoil everything, might do a separate video on Wasted Potential that does a deep dive on that later, no promises about if or when, just maybe. But like I said, I did overall enjoy the show. So, my goal with this video and the level of spoilers I'll be talking about is to express what those problems are without spoiling everything so you can make an informed call about whether or not you're interested in watching it without entirely taking away the suspense of the plot. I personally knew almost everything I'm going to mention before I started watching it, and I still enjoyed it. But if you entirely want to avoid spoilers, you'll want to stop this video now and come back once you've finished the show or at least made more progress on it. So, Arc 5 is a series that was in many ways meant to celebrate the history of the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise, or at the very least the anime aspect of the franchise. The real nature of the setting is that the dimension that our characters start in is called the Standard Dimension, and there are 3 other dimensions that exist in this setting. The XZ dimension, based upon the world of Zeal, the Synchro dimension, based upon the world of 5Ds, and the Fusion dimension, based upon the world of GX. This means that there are returning characters and concepts from the older shows kind of, which is really cool, but comes with a rather unique set of narrative challenges. Other franchises like Kamen Rider, Super Sentai, Gundam, Mazinger, and Pretty Cure have done this, but it's still something that's pretty fucking rare in media overall. There needs to be decisions made about the priorities of the series, and those decisions and the specifics of their execution could very possibly disappoint or isolate longtime fans or new potential viewers. In addition to the usual challenge of presenting an entertaining quality experience in regards to narrative, animation, characters, and moment-to-moment viewing experience, something Yugioh has struggled with in the past as far as I'm concerned, the staff also has to worry about juggling the integration of aspects of a multitude of previous series, which often have vastly different tones. The staff, at an early point of production, should be asking theoretical questions about potential viewers. What will a viewer new to the franchise think? What will a viewer who has seen everything think? What will, say, someone who has only watched 5Ds and came back because of their attachment to that series and only that series think? It's an added complication to a process that is already incredibly challenging. As someone who tends to be just a bit of an obsessive fangirl about the stuff I care about, the idea of series like this one really excite me on a conceptual level, but I usually walk away from series like this having had some degree of fun, which is of course incredibly important and appreciated, but still having been disappointed in some respect. As you can probably guess, that was absolutely the case for me with Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5. So the big mysterious plot thing, along with the dimension stuff, is that the Dual Academia from the Fusion/GX dimension, for spoilery plot reasons, have either already or are planning to invade the other dimensions and devastate them. Our main heroes participate in this cross-dimensional war, trying to save their own dimension and put a stop to the Academia's plans, while other characters may have their own goals related to that war or just kind of get affected by the war's crossfire. Reminder that I'm one of those long-term fans who has seen all of the old shows. I have some sort of emotional attachment to every single one of them, and I absolutely love this franchise and the potential it has, just for context on my opinions. As far as I'm concerned, Arc 5's biggest problem is that it doesn't commit enough in either direction towards the old or new in regards to its crossover concepts and characters. The dimensions differ from the worlds of the old series, but it never explains why they're different or why those worlds specifically are involved in this. They just are what they are because that's what they are. Any explanation, even a throwaway one for those things, would have gone a long way towards making me okay with all the differences and contrivances. It came off to me as a lazy excuse to not have to adhere to the rules of the old settings or to avoid having the plots of the old settings going on, while still getting to pick and choose which characters and aesthetics of those settings to integrate. I would have much preferred if it was literally just the exact settings from the previous shows. It's just that the Arc 5 plot disrupts whatever was happening at the time, or if it was each of those settings after the events of their respective narratives. Also, for a series that is meant to celebrate the history of the franchise, it fails in two rather major respects. For one, the protagonists of the old shows just don't exist. Like, there are only a few returning characters from each series, but it's shocking that not a single protagonist gets to return. They're never mentioned or alluded to in any respect, they're just not there. This is another instance where literally any explanation would have gone a long way to making me okay with what's going on here. There is also, bafflingly enough, absolutely zero reference to the original series, which feels strange to say the least. Like, GX and Duel Monsters explicitly take place in the same world and are only set a few years apart. Yugi is at the very beginning of GX. Like, come on. So the Fusion dimension absolutely should have had some of that Duel Monster stuff going on. I just don't understand why they would do a show like this and then not include anything that ties into the original series in any respect. That's the show that started it all. If anything, I'd expect the opposite sort of problem, that it would get way too many references compared to the series that came after it. Like fucking Pokemon, which, hey, wow, that has a bunch of its own problems right now, huh? Fuck. Not that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has any ground to stand on considering how Sevens looks. Ugh. The protagonists are never my favorite characters in these shows, and I do really like which characters they did choose to pull from previous series for the most part, but it still feels wrong that they didn't even get nods of some kind. The characters that do come back are the same in some ways and different in others. This can be good or bad. It, as it so very often does, comes down to the execution. To discuss this, we're going to look a bit at the Synchro/5Ds dimension, which returning characters are chosen, and how they fit into the narrative. Pretty minor spoilers for the second arc, not going to delve too deep, but I can't think of another way to examine this, so there's your second spoiler alert for this stuff if this somehow worries you more than the first one. I don't fucking know, whatever, we're going. Jack Atlas is the obvious pull from 5Ds if Yusei isn't on the table. Society-wise, his character is in the same place as he was at the beginning of 5Ds, i.e. he's found a place for himself with the upper class, while not really doing anything to help the lower class that's suffering pretty fucking horribly. Good on this show for still including that element of the 5D setting. If anything, it's even more of a focus here because there's not all the Iliaster stuff going on. It's just asshole rich people being rich assholes. But despite him being an active part of sustaining the existing system of oppression, we're expected to believe that he's the good person that he was after large parts of his character development had happened in 5Ds, when he was a mostly good person and his life was in a completely different place. These two things don't really seem to mesh, both from the perspective of knowing Jack's character from 5Ds and just considering the Arc 5 version of him in isolation. Either he's supposed to be an asshole, which isn't what the show's presentation seems to indicate, or you have to make giant leaps of logic to explain why and how this contradiction could exist, and the explanations provided in the show just felt hollow to me. He didn't feel like the same character in a different context, he felt like an entirely different character who just happened to have the same face. As far as I'm concerned, the Jack Atlas in Arc 5 might as well have been a new character. Like, there's a moment of, oh shit, cool, Jack, he's doing Jack things, that's fucking cool, Jack's so fucking cool, but that moment doesn't last. If he just doesn't feel like the same character. It would have been cool if they just full-on made Jack a villain, but they didn't, so oh well. Even just looking at Arc 5 alone, Jack's character isn't really interesting. It felt like the viewer was expected to care and side with him because of the stuff from 5Ds, which I'm sure does literally nothing for people who didn't watch that show. And as someone who did watch that show and really enjoyed Jack's character there, I was disappointed by his implementation. It's the worst possible outcome for a crossover type scenario. New fans are isolated and left behind, returning fans, or at the very least me, as an old fan and fans like me, are disappointed. Meanwhile, I actually like Crow in Arc 5 more than in 5Ds. He's doing exactly what he did in 5Ds, fighting for the oppressed lower classes. This time, however, he's there from very near the start of the arc, and it doesn't feel like he's stealing the spotlight from Aki. Aki isn't here at all, actually, which saddens me, but there's that whole real-world drama with that, so I digress. Point is, he's the kind of character in the context of a new setting done right. He feels just like he did in 5Ds, but the differing details of this new setting inform some of the new details of his character. This wouldn't have had as much of an impact if he were a new character instead of a returning one, and his character and motivations are understandable here even without having seen 5Ds. Most of the returning characters fell into one of these two extremes. There's more good than bad on that front, but when it was bad, I absolutely fucking hated it because it felt like it was disgracing the legacy of those characters. For the most part, an excellent job is done of making each dimension feel very much like the setting it's based on. There are some differences in the specifics, like the names of some cities, but from a design perspective, they all look like their respective inspirations. For example, the Synchro dimension has a hierarchical society where the upper class are called tops and the lower class are called bottoms, commons. It still focuses on the oppression and exploitation of the lower class by the upper class, very much has those cyberpunk trappings still going on, and the dueling is still used as a mechanism to keep that oppression in place. The new characters from these settings often feel like they walked right out of those old shows, new archetypes feel like they would have fit right into those series as well. It feels rather nostalgic. Not as nostalgic as actually just returning to those settings would have been, of course, but this also avoids isolating newer fans. I understand the decision at least. Again, I just wish there had been some sort of explanation given, instead of stuff just being like this because shut up. See, a lot of things have the surface level aesthetics of stuff from old shows without their meaning for either the game or the setting. Still, looking at the Synchro dimension, our biggest example of this is the return of riding duels. I was excited to see them return. The part of my brain that loves cool dumb shit loved and still loves those in 5Ds, but if you've actually seen 5Ds, you'll know that riding duels come with special rules and mechanics that differentiate them from standard duels. In Arc 5, none of those rules are present, so it's literally just card games on motorcycles, with no more depth than that. The facial tattoos also return from 5Ds, but they don't have the same context in the setting either, that being marks placed on criminals so that they can be tracked and easily identified as criminals. I know it's not the same because characters talk about how they've never been arrested but still have those marks, and other characters who are arrested don't wind up with these facial tattoos like they would have in 5Ds. It's all of the style with none of the substance, and that substance is what gave the surface level cool depth and meaning. It's what took it from, oh, that was a cool thing, to highlights that I could look back on years after the fact as examples of interesting writing and world building. Also, the XZ dimension took away the scouters and eye makeup for augmented reality, so what was even the fucking point of all of this? Seriously though, I think if you're gonna be doing a crossover type of series, you should be making it specifically for people who have seen the old stuff. Catch people up with flashbacks or discussions between characters or whatever, wherever you need to. But if you're not going to commit to the returning stuff, then what's the point? Having a new main character is already a huge step towards not isolating new viewers. But as is, if you don't commit to the old stuff hard enough, it's going to foster disappointment with returning fans, at least the ones like me, and at least some level of confusion in the new ones. If you're not going to commit to being faithful to the old stuff, then I honestly think it would be a better decision to just make new characters. Then they don't have to worry about adapting old stuff to fit the new narrative, they can just do literally whatever they want, without that extra expectation placed upon them. Like, it's fun for a while to see those returning characters, sure, but I might have just as easily wound up liking new characters. In fact, that's exactly what happened. My favorite character in the entire franchise is one of the characters introduced in this series. There are also some problems not directly tied to the crossover aspects of the show, because of course there are. This is Yugioh. Some of the usual stuff returns. Yugioh really doesn't like to permanently kill off characters, which can cheapen some of the best, most emotional scenes. At least all the ones in Arc 5 conceptually make sense, and if you're paying attention, you can probably guess where a lot of these are going to come from. But there's one specific reversal that happens near the end, where the show tries so hard to surprise the viewer with a return that it contradicts the explanation for why. Kind of. Point is, it feels really fucking bad. And of course, the women don't remain relevant for very long. All of the women in this series are either only around for an incredibly short period of time, or turned into plot MacGuffin Chaos Emeralds for almost exclusively guys to fight over, or both of these things. It did feel especially bad in this one because early on it seemed like Yuzu was going to have a massive role, and she does, but not as a duelist. Boo. Aside from those two shitty duels near the start, a lot of the problems I have start to pop up near the end of the show. I'm gonna dance around spoilers on these, so forgive me for being vague. I hope people who have seen the show will be able to follow, and those who haven't get some useful information out of it. Anyway, there's a character who has a face turn, that is, becomes a hero, that feels incredibly undeserved. It really seems like it comes out of nowhere, and is probably something that large chunks of the cast shouldn't accept readily. Like, that character is very intentionally, and with all of the available information, really fucking evil, and they just become good. The reasons given aren't at all convincing to me. Most of the bad guy turned good guy moments in Arc 5 feel very earned by Yuya and friends, but this one definitely doesn't. The arc that takes place in the XZ/Zeal dimension is overly short, underutilized, and where most of the wasted potential of Arc 5 comes from. Overall, this arc is supposed to serve as the last build-up right before we head into the final chunk of the plot. On a macro scale, it's meant to reinforce just how evil the villains are and really, really drive home why they need to be stopped. The shit that's happening here gets resolved with relative ease, which feels bad considering this particular aspect of the conflict has had build-up since near the very beginning of the show. It doesn't erase the overall impact of that aspect of the story, but it does cheapen it, which is sort of exactly the opposite of what this arc was trying to accomplish. What would have helped a lot was a flashback episode, or maybe a couple of episodes, detailing how stuff got as bad as it did here, with a focus on Shun and his allies fighting against the academia and everything that entailed. There's one character in particular whose motivations are implied along with an implied character death, but only if you're familiar with stuff from Zeal. Showing what happened to that character in the past of Arc 5 would have contextualized the character in a way that new viewers can understand and care about, while rewarding returning fans for engaging with and caring about previous series. As it stands, the best part of the arc is the opening, especially the first few seconds of it, for reasons. Best Yu-Gi-Oh opening, by the way. So there's another long-standing Yu-Gi-Oh problem that I didn't mention yet that is very much present here. The final boss duel against the Big Bad, which I can't show at fucking all, cause spoilies, is the worst one yet. The entire series actually cleanly leads up to this conflict. It's foreshadowed from very early on and builds gradually until the plot reaches it. The concept is really cool, and it's actually rather different in many respects from the other Yu-Gi-Oh! Final bosses, but it's still really, really shitty. Of course, there's the obvious part. The deck the final boss is using is completely unfair bullshit garbage, but in addition to that, the duel is set up in such a way that it takes significantly longer than other final boss duels, and winds up feeling formulaic in of itself. Conceptually, this is by far my favorite final boss, but in execution, it's by far the worst one. Execution is way more fucking important than the idea. A boring idea executed on well can still be something enjoyable. A great idea with shitty execution is just a shitty thing that could have been better. Also, the epilogue for Arc 5 is surprisingly long. There's a good 8 episodes that take place after the big problem is dealt with. I'm not opposed to long epilogues in the slightest, but here it really feels like a waste of time. Like, we don't get a huge time skip and see everyone all grown up or anything. There's just kind of a couple of duels. In some respects, it's the closest Arc 5 ever comes to filler. A good half of those duels just feel completely unnecessary. They should have taken half of those episodes and used them to flesh out the XZ Dimension arc as far as I'm fucking concerned. The animation varies in quality. The 3D models that are sometimes present are usually pretty awful, especially when characters are riding around on monsters and stuff like that. But at times, the animation is absolutely incredible, including some instances of 3D animation too. It's a mixed bag, but the moments that really count are almost all animated well, and that's kind of how most long-form anime go these days, so it's fine in that respect, I suppose. Also, the Synchro Dimension features another tournament. I feel it's executed on well again, but it does feel a bit repetitive to hop from one tournament arc almost immediately into another one. In my opinion, because, you know, that's kind of the whole thing here, the good parts of Arc 5 outweigh the bad. The show does a surprisingly good job of juggling how many moving parts it has. There are a lot of characters in this show, and almost all of them, with the exception of the women, gods damn it, are treated well. Almost all of them have a moment to shine and participate in the plot when it makes sense for them to do so. This probably ties into the fact that most everything in Arc 5 feels very well planned out. I touched on this before, but it is something that is very, very important. Unplanned writing is how you get the disjointed feeling of the new fucking Star Wars trilogy. Unplanned things can be tied together well, given enough time and writing skill, but it's an obstacle to be overcome. Most stories that are more than just okay, or like fun, I guess, have at least a basic level of planning that goes into nearly every aspect of the narrative. In Arc 5, there's foreshadowing and plot elements. Most every character arc feels really good and complete. Things don't just happen solely to surprise the viewers, and the villains have long-term build-up and thus narrative importance, as opposed to just showing up out of nowhere and suddenly spewing Star Wars quotes. I should probably play FF9 sometime, huh? Another big part of this is that there's absolutely no filler. Like, there are a couple of episodes that have wacky shenanigans that go on, but aside from those 2 boring duels near the start, every single episode matters in big or small ways, with the exception of those 2 early boring duels, the final boss duel and the epilogue. I never felt like Arc 5 was wasting my time. This is a very good feeling for a show with over 100 episodes, and it's a fucking far cry from Zeal dragging its feet for the majority of its first half. Speaking of Zeal, that series had an almost entirely meh soundtrack, and I'm happy to report that that isn't the case in Arc 5. The vast majority of the soundtrack is fun to listen to, and I do on occasion find myself listening to the Arc 5 OST. My favorite tracks on the soundtrack are Duel of Rebellion and Wavering Feelings. I think that Arc 5 does the best job out of all of the series of giving characters decks that fit them both in playstyle and theme. This is in no small part because of all of the different special summoning types that are present. It's sort of hit and miss throughout the rest of the franchise, but here, decks further characterize the, characters in nearly every instance. It's another thing that's very simple, but it being executed on well feels really, really good, especially because it's a unique flavor of fighting style compared to other action anime. There's a character who wants an uprising of the oppressed, and he uses a deck with bees that work together to be stronger, like people would use numbers in a revolution. Hashtag liberate Hong Kong. The steadfast, straightforward Gongenzoka uses a deck composed of only monsters, and he never uses action cards because it would disable the abilities of his archetype. So while in action duels, he just proudly stands there while his opponent runs around. This is also true of Yuya himself. He wants to spread smiles and entertain, and his deck is themed after the circus. The cast of characters is fucking phenomenal. With the massive cast, there were very few characters that I didn't like, which is a huge accomplishment as far as I'm concerned. Yuya himself, I found among my favorite characters of Arc 5. I've come to like the characters who remain incredibly optimistic and try to do the right thing no matter how dire the situation gets, and Yuya fits that role. Seeing how he has to deal with some of the rather dark stuff in the plot, and how he struggles to remain true to his philosophy of entertainment and trying to bring smiles is interesting. In almost every instance, Yuya feels like he earns his victories, and with the narrative as dire as it is, that's a really important aspect of stakes remaining high. Yuya does get a partner at some point in the series, even showing any of that as big spoilies. Basically, I just think it's cool, but it's not utilized nearly as often as Atem was or Astral was. He also gets a special power, again, big fucking spoilers if I were to delve into the details, but I think everything about it is fucking awesome. It takes his character in an interesting direction, and it ties very smoothly into the main narrative. Sawatari is a character who I early on thought of as a contender for my favorite character, if only because he fits into an archetype I like a lot in fiction. He's an absolute scumbag who softens a bit as the narrative advances, but everything about his personality screams that he should be a villain. And for one reason or another, he winds up helping out the heroes. Characters who kind of don't want to be there or kind of despise the protagonist but are helping out anyway for whatever reason are really fun to me. I like that dynamic, especially if it leads to the would-be villain turning into an actual hero. Vegeta's my favorite Dragon Ball character is what I'm saying. Then there's Reiji. See, a lot of characters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Get accused of being short-sighted, dumb, or naive. That's kind of just shown in anime in general, but Reiji is none of these things. The way he plays four-dimensional chess throughout the plot and actually seems to be able to quickly understand situations he's placed in and make intelligent decisions based on the information available is really enjoyable to watch. It's one of the very rare instances in fiction where the narrative effectively expressed how intelligent he was instead of just telling the audience he was smart. Or worse, just outright lying to the audience for the sake of dramatic, smart revelations doled out by the character. He is another one of those characters who feels a lot like a villain, but is on the side of good. Instead of a scumbag like Sawatari, he's a Xanatos-style mastermind type, and he's using those mastermind abilities to manipulate people for the greater good. I fucking love characters like this. His deck's theme is heavily tied into this. He uses every summoning type except for rituals, fucking of course, and he has to make contracts with demons to accomplish goals, while usually finding ways to avoid paying the costs of those contracts. These costs are usually life points. He's a manipulator willing to do fucked up stuff for the greater good. The deck is perfect for him. Then there's my number one favorite Yu-Gi-Oh! Character, my edgy child, Shun Kurosaki. Shun's basic thing is that he's a hyper-serious, angry, edgy character. I think he's actually a more effective foil for Yuya than Reiji. This might just be because Reiji is usually busy somewhere off-screen for most of the show. Shun's absolutely obsessed with getting revenge against the Academia. I won't spoil the details, but golly gosh does he have some justifiable reasons. Also, I can relate to his hatred of things related to GX. It reaches the point where he even relishes in the opportunity to torment those associated with the Academia. My two favorite characters in this whole franchise basically walk on screen and immediately attempt to murder someone. But they're the good guys! I fucking love that! A hyper-serious character in a franchise that very often tends to have goofy characters at the forefront, something that is true even in Arc 5, is fucking amazing to me. He radically affects the tone of the show just by, being around and reminding everyone constantly of how serious the threat they're up against is. For me, his character backstory and arc were the most emotionally affecting things in the show. Every single one of his duels was fucking astounding. I adore his archetype. It's my favorite deck to play in real life. Not that I've played in a while, and even when I did, it was just with friends, but still. They're called Raid Raptors, and they're made up of robotic birds of prey who are generally pretty weak in attack points, but have effects that punish the opponent for using special summon monsters. They're an XC deck, which is my favorite type of summoning, as I'm sure anyone who has seen my other Yu-Gi-Oh videos is well aware at this point. Character-wise, in the past, he dealt with overwhelming power from the villains, and now he uses a deck that turns their own power against them. I love it conceptually. I think it's fun to play, and I love how it ties into Shun's character. Also, Shun uses rank-up magics. This assumption I'm about to make is a bit of a stretch considering how little lore carries over between the old shows to this one, but I at least like to think that the rank-up magic that he uses still has the same lore as in Zeal. Whether that's true or not, rank-up magic is fucking radical. Oh, also, there are a ton of summon chants throughout Arc 5. Pretty much all of them are amazing, and Shun's are absolutely my favorites. Everything that can have summon chants should have summon chants.
俺はランクアップマジックソウルシェインフォースを発動俺はライフを半分払い墓地からレボリューションファルコンを特殊召喚するそしてこれを素材にオーバーレイ勇猛果敢なるハヤブサよ怒りの炎を巻き上げ大地をも焼き尽くす先行となれランクアップエクシードチェンジ飛翔しろランク8レイドラプターズサテライトキャノンファルコン
Arc 5 is a far cry from perfect. I had problems, some rather big ones, but overall, most of the time I spent with Arc 5 was fun. It doesn't take a long time to be enjoyable like Zeal, but the fact that some of the most climactic moments are among the weakest parts of the show is a real bummer. It leaves a bad taste in that respect, but the parts I enjoyed, I fucking love. It feels like almost every aspect of the show, with the exception of the bad parts, of course, feed into and improve each other, and those bad parts I felt didn't cancel out the parts I did enjoy. Plus, there's really not a lot of places to scratch this card game anime itch. I should catch up on Vanguard sometime, shouldn't I? The point is that for the vast majority of the time I was watching it, I was having fun, and a lot of it, so how could I not recommend it overall? This has been your girl Kalice. Liking, linking, and Patreoning exist. If you wish to partake, keep loving what you love, and I'll see you next time with something else.